We're going to talk, actually, you have a proposal for a value-added tax that we're going to get to in a minute. But you're undoubtedly, your best known position would be the UBI.
Freedom Dividend or Universal Basic Income, yes.
Yeah. So to what extent does the government have a duty to address income inequality? Is providing that kind of base income enough?
Well, we have to do a lot of things. But the reality is income inequality is at historic highs right now, and it's going to compound on itself as technology becomes more advanced. So I'm going to give you an example most people would probably understand. Let's say that a company develops artificial intelligence software that gets rid of truck drivers or call center workers. That would be a disaster for many Americans who do those jobs. There are 2.5 million call center workers making $14 an hour right now in the United States. And so if I have a tech company and I devise software that replaces those 2.5 million workers, I'm going to harvest billions of dollars in revenue and value. And then how much of that will the public see? The public will see next to none of it, because if I'm a big multinational tech company, I'm expert in not paying meaningful taxes. So the income inequality is unfortunately set to compound and build on itself. And if you don't want a society where literally the top 1% of individuals and companies and shareholders harvest more and more of the value, then you have no choice but to have the government serve as a counterweight. Now, the universal basic income is the most direct and effective way to humanize and balance out the economy. There are other things we should do as well, but nothing is going to work without something like a universal basic income that directly puts the money into our hands, because the market is going to become more and more of an accelerant for the inequality. The market is turning on more and more Americans, where we have this capital efficiency system that rewards short-term profits and shareholder value, and if you're an average American, you're left on the outside of that.
So the universal basic income would provide $1,000 a month to everybody, all legal citizens.
Yes.
And the contention is that it will then be somewhat counteracted in savings by not having to spend, or the government not having to spend on social programs as much as it does now. But how do you guarantee that somebody's not going to get caught in the middle, where they're getting $12,000 a year in more in income that's guaranteed, but then if you're cutting back on some of these social program spending, they're going to lose something that's more valuable to them?
Well, first, I have zero interest in trying to take anything away from Americans. And so the Freedom Dividend is opt-in. And if you prefer your current situation for any reason, then you're going to be able to keep your benefits and programs. I'm not trying to pull a rug out from under anyone who's depending upon a government program for their benefits or well-being. The Freedom Dividend is opt-in, and if you opt in, then you're choosing to forego certain cash and cash-like benefits. But this does not include Medicare, Medicaid, housing assistance, or any of like the big ticket items. This is just a replacement for cash and cash equivalent programs, and it's only if you decide that this is a better situation for you than your current program benefits. Now, I've talked to people who are receiving benefits around the country, and they live in fear of their benefits being reduced or taken away. They live in fear of them not fulfilling an administrative requirement and someone saying, hey, you no longer qualify for this fuel subsidy or this food stamp voucher. And so if you say to them, hey, how about if you had unconditional cash and it can't be taken away from you, they literally jump for joy and say like, well, that's impossible. That's too good to be true. So the goal is to improve the foundation for Americans and not take anything away.
Okay. But there would be certainly a cost to providing that basic income.
You mean in money, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah, it costs money to give people $1,000 a month.
Yeah, of course. So every candidate in this race has some big ticket ideas that would be costly. And college debt, overhauling healthcare, energy infrastructure, entitlement overhauls.
Sure.
So we have a national debt that's already over $22 million.
Trillion.
Yes. I'm sorry.
It's also
wish it was,
22 million.
We wish it was. Yeah. So it was accurate. Just underplaying it a little. How important is lowering that deficit?
I've run businesses and organizations, and when you have a balance sheet problem, there are two things you look at, and you know this well. It's revenue and expenses. So in the U.S., we have a major revenue problem. If you have $1 trillion company like Amazon paying zero in taxes and it's not alone, you look around and say, hey, Netflix also paying zero in taxes. Like, you start identifying the fact that you have some of the biggest, most successful companies in our economy today paying zero in taxes. That's a massive revenue problem. And so what you do is you put a mechanism in place to make it so that we get a tiny slice, our fair share of every Amazon sale, every Google search, every Facebook ad, eventually every robot truck mile. You generate hundreds of billions in new revenue very, very quickly, including from stuff like the artificial intelligence software that's going to come and eat away a lot of these jobs. Under our current corporate income tax system, we're going to see zero of that value. But if you get a slice of every AI work unit, then you can generate hundreds of billions in new revenue very, very quickly. This is the revenue problem, and this is fundamental. We're never going to get our way out of this if we're looking at taxing the town dentist. Like, it doesn't matter. There's a joke, like Willie Sutton, the bank robber, why did you rob the banks? Because that's where the money was. Where is the money today? It's with the Amazons, Googles, Facebooks, Ubers, like these mega companies. And one of the things I say is like, look, Jeff Bezos is worth $100 million post-divorce. If I increase the marginal tax rate to 65, 70, 75%, how much of his $100 billion do I get? Virtually none of it. Because he's not dumb enough to pay himself $5 billion a year where we can tax it at 70, 75%. Most of his value is in Amazon stock. The way you get the money is you set up a toll for his business where every Amazon sale you get a tiny slice. This is what every other developed country has already done. We are the only major economy in the world that does not have a value-added tax because they've figured out that it makes no sense for the Amazons to pay zero in taxes. So when you talk about the deficit, the biggest problem you address is the revenue problem. Now, is there an expense problem too? Yes. And so you have to look at the expenses and figure out how you can rationalize them, make them more efficient. The biggest, most conspicuous one is the military defense budget of $650 billion or so a year. And a lot of that is not making us safer at this point. So part of that budget you would try and transfer to something that has higher economic returns, like infrastructure, which you'll have an ongoing need for. So there are expense problems, but you can't get yourself trapped in an expense problem mindset exclusively when the bigger problem is the revenue problem. And as someone who's run organizations, you know this well, too, Tom, that if you have a choice, you try and choose growth. You can't cut costs to success. And that's where the U.S., in my mind, is making a mistake right now, where we're looking around saying we have to cut costs. It's actually the reverse. We have to increase revenues.
And so here we are back at the value-added tax. So explain that in a little bit more detail in terms of what percent on what to raise how much money.
Sure. So value-added tax is a system that's been implemented by every other major economy in the world. And it's essentially a consumption tax, where when you consume something, there's a toll associated with it. Now, the difference with a value-added tax is it applies at every step in production. So if I was making a watch, let's say, when I bought the strap, I would pay the value-added tax to the strap maker. When I bought the parts, I would pay the value-added tax. And then at the end of the day, when I sell it to you, the value-added tax gets built in. The average value-added tax in the European Union is 20%. I'm proposing a value-added tax at a baseline of half that level of 10%. But the great thing is that you can actually scale the value-added tax to fall more heavily on things that you want to tax more, like let's call it yachts, artificial intelligence, and luxury watches, which I'm not sure if this qualifies as luxury. I'm not sure if it would be heavy. And then you could have the value-added tax be low or even zero on things like diapers, eggs, toilet paper, consumer staples that Americans consume a lot of. But even at a mild 10% baseline, you're looking at generating another $800 billion in annual revenue with a giant up arrow attached to it, because as more and more value gets generated by technologies, that number just keeps on going up and up.
But like if you're in the IRS, how would you like tax data transactions or things like that? And also, like, how do you avoid all that just getting pushed on to the consumer without anything really changing from what these tech companies are already paying?
Well, the great thing is you actually know how much value is changing hands because of the money that's changing hands, which is what every other economy already is doing. So if you, and so we should own our own data, which is a whole other conversation, because right now our data is worth more than oil, and we see none of that value. Our data is getting sold and resold and packaged and repackaged by these tech companies. We see none of it. We're none the wiser. We just hope for the best, hope they don't get it hacked and like bad things happen. So we should participate in the value that's being generated from our data. But the companies themselves that are profiting from our data know how much they're profiting, and so you just pay a toll on that. It would end up creating transparency in realms right now where it's completely opaque in a black box. And again, every other major economy already has this. So all of the global accounting firms will just take all of the rules that they have that apply in Canada, in Europe, in China, and just start applying them to the US. So it's really straightforward in terms of implementation. Now, does some of this end up falling on the consumer? It's possible. In most every case, businesses end up doing a bit of both, where you end up eating some of it and passing some of it to consumers. But keep in mind, we are increasing the buying power of every American by $12,000 a year. So the only way I end up being a net payer is if I'm consuming over $100,000 in goods and services on an annual basis, which applies to a very limited range of Americans. We're talking about the top 6% or so of Americans that would end up being net payers. But the great thing is, if you have this system set up, you get billions from the Jeff Bezoses of the world, because you get a toll on his business coming in. And then when he spends $1 billion a year on rockets to Mars, which is literally what he spends his money on, you get a toll on that too. You get a toll on all of the major value flows, which then ends up funding $1,000 a month in our hands, which ends up making us stronger, healthier, mentally healthier, more productive, better decision makers, lower domestic violence, higher graduation rates, like all of the good things that you'd want to see in an economy and society.
So
I don't quite understand this net payer concept. So if you get this value-added tax added on a product as it goes through the chain, why is it going to cost the consumer more?
Why isn't?
Yeah.
Well, in my example of the watch, like if I had to pay all of my component manufacturers like an extra little tax on each of them, then maybe I go to the consumer and say, hey, this cost me like an extra $20 to produce, so I'm going to charge you an extra $22 or something along those lines. That would happen in some industries and some verticals. And so in my example of the yacht, it's like if in my system the yacht, instead of costing $40 million, it costs $44 million or something like that, then the yacht buyer would end up paying the extra into the system. And so that ends up increasing the buying power of, again, about 94% of Americans, and the top 6% or so would be net payers. Now, this is something that the folks who are at the tippy top of society are actually more comfortable with because they actually have control of their own consumption decisions. But they would end up, I asked them, it's like, hey, would it actually change consumption behavior? And they're like, no. Like, I'd still end up consuming the things I naturally would. I would just end up paying more in. This is much more effective and efficient than a wealth tax that some of the other candidates have been proposing, because when the wealth tax has been tried in other countries, it was repealed in Germany, France, Sweden, Denmark. All of these countries that tried a wealth tax found that there were massive implementation and compliance problems, and it did not generate anywhere near the revenue they were hoping for. So the fact that this has already been tried and repealed in other developed countries, to me, is a very, very clear sign that if we tried in the U.S., we'd have a very similar outcome. And so it strikes me as either an optimistic or unrealistic way to try and pay for various social proposals, because they're assuming that it's going to work here on a level that it has not worked anywhere else. Whereas a value-added tax has worked in every other developed country for years.
So we'll move on to healthcare here. So obviously Medicare for All has been kind of the central, one of the central issues in the campaign so far. It takes a lot of time at debates. A lot of voters asking about it.
I noticed. I'm there on stage watching.
Didn't mean to bring up a story for you.
Watching them.
But while we have you, here, and for all the folks watching, what do you, how do you define your version of Medicare for All, and then what do you do about a transition towards that system away from our private insurance heavy status quo?
So I've run a number of organizations, and what I know is that we're already paying for healthcare through the nose in so many different ways. And so if you own, let's say, a newspaper, it adds to your costs on a per employee basis, but it also makes it harder to hire new people and make them full-time employees because you have this giant cost associated with it. It makes it harder for people to change jobs. It makes it harder for people certainly to start a new business because you're nervous about what you're going to do about your healthcare coverage. So there are all these current costs baked into our healthcare system. And if we start trying to make that more efficient, we can actually get the costs down very quickly because there's a ton of waste in the system. And right now there's massive price gouging and frankly just profiteering on the part of drug companies, device companies, and private insurance companies at astronomical levels. So my plan is a public option that competes against the private insurance plans. It does not make them illegal, but it will end up pushing them out of the marketplace pretty quickly because the economics will be compelling for the average consumer at a very, very high level.
Yeah, I mean, well, everyone says that either there's waste and stuff, but what do you do about like reimbursement rates, where especially you talk to rural hospitals and rural healthcare providers? I mean, most of those bills are being covered by the, if you will, the excess that private insurance is covering, when Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements are a little bit under like 80% at most of these places. I mean, how do you implement an adjustment like that to make that public option competitive when right now our public programs are not covering the full slate of costs?
So there are actually two questions embedded in what you described. So number one is the decision on the part of the individual. So if you had a public option available here, and then your employer were to say to you, hey, I actually want to know, and I've been in this position. Would you rather your current situation where I pay for your health insurance, you have a small copay premium, and we go on as is, or you actually make use of this public plan and I give you a raise because I'm going to save a lot of money? Like right now, I'm spending on average between 5 and 6% of my revenue on your health care, and that's a lot of money. And so in this new world, you can have the public option and I'll give you a several percent raise. So that's the decision that an individual worker could have, and then they can figure out which they prefer. Now the second question is what happens to the hospital or the service provider if they're getting reimbursed at the Medicare rate across the board as opposed to the rates that private insurance have. So they're related questions. What you'd see is you'd end up with a mix because right now, as you say, like you have a mixture of people who are getting who have Medicare reimbursement rates and then private insurance, and so that ratio would change over time. And it's not the case that Medicare reimbursement rates are fixed. Like we can actually calibrate them and adjust them if, for whatever reason, as you assume market share, it's insufficient for various providers. But when you talk about the excess of this 3.6 trillion we're spending, about $1 trillion of it is waste. That $1 trillion in waste is not going to the bottom line of the hospitals or the providers or the doctors' offices. That $1 trillion in waste is getting spirited up to the private insurance companies, the device companies, and the drug companies. So you're actually misattributing where all that excess is landing. We're not going to impoverish the hospitals if we rationalize drug prices, as one example.
So, one healthcare issue that's a big concern in this area, and you've spent so much time here, is the opioid crisis. It's on a lot of people's minds in New Hampshire, probably Iowa too.
Yeah, it's true. Both Iowa and New Hampshire have been very hard hit by the opioid crisis.
Yeah. So for the past 8 years or so, we've been asking candidates, their thoughts on what to do to address it, and pretty much everybody says, well, we're going to put more money into this. So money's good, but they've been putting money into it, and the crisis seems to not be getting better.
Yes,
so
there's not a money problem fundamentally.
So what is the problem? How do you resolve this? What steps need to be taken?
First, it is literally criminal that we have this opiate plague in New Hampshire and around the country that was initiated by Purdue Pharma marketing OxyContin as a non-addictive wonder drug to millions of Americans. They were fined $600 million or so, which sounds like a lot until you realize they made $30 billion. So they had a 2% fine, and they've killed tens of thousands of Americans. 8 an hour are still dying of drug overdoses. So number one, this is a disease of capitalism run amok to the worst degree you can imagine. And people need to go to jail, and you need to claw back billions of dollars of that revenue to try and make communities stronger and more whole. Now, to your laying it out, you're right, this is not a money problem. But money should not be the obstacle. This is a human problem. We all have friends, family members, neighbors who are struggling with addiction. So you need to go bigger. Now, if you're the government and you say, look, this happened on our watch because we're so bad at our jobs that we actually allowed a private company to kill tens, hundreds of thousands of Americans and make billions of dollars. So criminalizing this behavior now is not the right way to go, because this is not an individual failure, this is a systemic failure. So number one, you try and put the money into communities to say there's going to be adequate treatment and counseling. But number two, you adopt the same approach that Portugal and other developed countries have adopted, and you decriminalize these drugs for personal use. So if you get caught and you're selling, then you go to jail. You should not be profiting from selling these drugs. But if we catch you with heroin or fentanyl, and it's only a quantity that you would personally be using, then you do not go to jail. We take the drugs away from you, and we refer you straight to treatment and counseling that we fund. And then we also fund safe consumption sites. So it's not the case that when you get sent home, you just OD again. And here in New Hampshire, I talk to paramedics who tell me that they save an addict from drug overdose, and then they save that same addict the following week, because after they came out of the hospital, they're just going to go home and start doing the drugs again. They say they literally save the same people week after week. And this is not an individual problem. This is a systemic and societal problem. So we have to adopt a structural and societal solution instead of saying that this is a personal failing, which at this point you can't legitimately argue that in my mind.
So if paramedics are having to go back and administer Narcan and whatever to the same people over and over that keep using over and over,
yes.
How is decriminalizing helping that? It seems like it would make it worse.
Well, after they overdose the first time, you save them. And then if you decriminalize it, then instead of referring someone into the criminal justice system, you would refer them into treatment and counseling system, which includes, again, a safe consumption site, so the person isn't necessarily going home and overdosing again. They're actually going someplace where they can be overseen and have the oversight so that they don't kill themselves, frankly, on these drugs. And when you've had safe consumption sites in other locations, you've seen the overdose rate plummet and even the substance abuse rate plummet over time.
Okay. So you want to get people treatment. That's
And it should be fully funded by the federal government. Again, this is not a money problem solely. The fact is, if you get an addict into treatment, ordinarily it does not work the first time. Like, you have to have them in over and over and over again, and at every stage it's uncertain. So it's not solely a money problem, but money cannot be the obstacle, because there are many addicts who are suffering who, when they look at treatment options, they say, I can't afford this. And of course, right now, most of these services are not covered by insurance.
so something that seems very related to that issue is mental health and suicide
Yes.
rates that are rising. What do you see behind that, and how would you address it?
I love these questions because you're pressing on the real problems that people are living and experiencing. We have a mental health crisis in this country where not only drug overdoses, but suicides are also at record highs. Both suicides and drug overdoses have overtaken vehicle deaths for the first time in American history. And it has gotten so bad that our life expectancy as a country has declined for 3 years in a row, which is highly unusual in a developed country. It is so unusual that the last time that happened in the United States of America was 100 years ago during the Spanish flu of 1918, a global pandemic that killed millions. That's how far back you have to go to find another time when our life expectancy declined 3 years in a row, and right now it's declining because of suicides and drug overdoses. So this is a sign that our top-line economic indicators have diverged from our day-to-day lives, because you have corporate profits and GDP at record highs, and then also at record highs, depression, anxiety, suicide, stress levels, financial insecurity. And so what good is GDP growth if your people are more miserable, stressed out, dying, and killing themselves? We need to have a mental health initiative in this country that integrates it with our medical system more holistically. Because the fact is, if you show up in a hospital for diabetes or drug abuse or other problems, a lot of the time there's a mental health aspect to it. And in communities where they've integrated mental health with physical health, where if you saw a doctor for some condition, they actually say, hey, you should see this psychiatrist or therapist while you're here, you've seen results get significantly better. Now, one of the true reasons for this mental health crisis we're experiencing is technology, where if you look at our teenagers, you're seeing record high levels of anxiety and depression that are hand in hand with smartphone adoption and social media use. And I have friends in Silicon Valley who say flat out that we have the smartest engineers in the country turning supercomputers into dopamine delivery devices and slot machines for teenage girls. And they make millions of dollars doing it. And I'm a parent. I've got 2 boys, 7 and 4, one of whom is autistic. And I know that parents are completely outgunned. Like, if you look at it and say, oh, like, you know, it's up to the parent to figure out how their kid's going to use technology, it's totally bogus, because that kid, like, has that screen and they get absorbed into it at a very high level. And if you're a working parent, you know what? It's very hard to say, hey, stop using that screen when you're on your phone too, because you have to answer things like at night and on weekends and the rest of it. So we are outgunned. One way we can curb this mental health crisis is by having a department of the attention economy that gets into the guts of the social media apps and looks at the design choices they've made that are maximizing user engagement for their own profit to the detriment of the mental health of many of our young people.
Switch topics here to infrastructure. I'm sure you've seen in your trips across New Hampshire some of our aging infrastructure, not only here but across the country. But fixing it is an expensive proposition. So what would your priorities be to fix infrastructure, and how would you pay for it?
this is something I can't believe Donald Trump didn't get right. Like, I thought when he got elected, it's like, oh, at least we'll get some bridges and roads out of this. Because he's literally a real estate developer. I would have accepted his name on these bridges and roads to get them built. But he didn't. And so it just left more for us to do. Now, the great thing about infrastructure is that it pays for itself. And right now, we're at a point where our infrastructure has gone from behind the times to dangerous. I think we're at a D, according to the engineers who've evaluated it. And so we're well behind in investing hundreds of billions, even trillions, into our infrastructure, which includes not just our roads and highways, but also our schools, broadband access for rural areas. 99.9% of Americans should have high-speed internet access, and it's very clear why rural areas do not have it. It's because the internet service providers did the math and said, I can't make money laying this cable for like the last 20 miles. And so all you have to do if you're a government is come and say, okay, I get it. What dollar amount do we need to put down to make this worth your while? And then you're going to get revenue off of this community. So then we're going to get paid back on the investment over, let's call it a 10-year period. And then you can get the pipe laid very, very quickly. Like it's not very difficult if you just actually had the will and some federal investment. And so to me, because you're so far behind the curve, investing trillions of dollars in modernizing our infrastructure makes perfect sense. And I'm unconcerned somewhat about paying for it because done right, infrastructure ends up generating that amount of value and then some back for your society.
So are you talking about like just like bonding it, basically? Like having the federal government just cover, bonds for states and municipalities to do what they see fit? Or, I mean, are there things that you think like are not smart investments, let's say, on the more car-related end of the spectrum?
I mean, I love trains, but the reality is there are very few corridors in the United States where trains actually make sense. We're a very car-oriented society. There are things we can do that make our car usage much more energy efficient, and investing in that kind of infrastructure I'd be very, very excited about. I wish I could, I wish there were more use cases for high-speed trains in the United States.
And then on climate change, so, I mean, what we want to ask everybody pretty much is kind of how much, public investment should you be willing to back as president, but also, what kind of skin in the game should everyday Americans have? I mean, a lot of candidates talk about a dividend going back to folks, but ultimately, I mean, if the problem is as drastic as the science says it is, that can't be done in kind of a painless way. So if you want to do those things but prevent, let's say, like a yellow vest type situation in France, how drastic are you willing to act on climate change, and what can people expect to sacrifice?
So what we have to do is put aside this tug of war we've been kind of, in my mind, sort of faked into, where if you say, hey, we need to address climate change for the average American, the fear is that they think to themselves, oh no, you're talking to me about higher prices, fewer jobs, and greater inconvenience. No. And a lot of this is because we have a fairly narrow way of measuring economic value that incorporates tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. So if you look at that and say, wait a minute, we've been subsidizing this industry for billions of dollars every year for decades. So step number one is you transfer those subsidies to renewable forms of energy. And you say, look, fossil fuel companies, like, you're going to be fine. You'll still be able to make like a very, very fair return. Number two, you have to price carbon immediately. And I'm suggesting you start with $40 a ton and then it rises over time. Anyone who studied these problems knows that one of the biggest things you have to address is an economic externality. And pollution is perhaps the greatest economic externality of them all, where you emit and you don't pay a price for that, and then we all end up paying the price for it over time. So if you price it into the company's productions, then you create an incentive structure where it's like, okay, if I reduce my emissions, then I actually am going to save some money. And that makes energy intensive things more expensive over time. You start measuring your economy based in part upon environmental sustainability. Because if you have these narrow measurements and you say, oh, it's going to cost us money, you're failing to account for the catastrophic cost of climate change itself. Which, if you amortize it over time, you're talking about trillions of dollars in damage and hundreds of thousands of lives. Yeah. And so if you start introducing those costs into how you're measuring your economic progress, then you see, wait a minute, by investing in solar panels and wind turbines and the rest of it, you're actually averting the cost curve and moving your economy in a positive direction, and it's not, quote unquote, costing you money.
Yeah.
Now, one of the main reasons why we're trapped in this particular conversation is that most Americans can't pay their bills. 78% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. Almost half of us can't afford an unexpected $500 bill. So the very human reaction, if I show up to you and say, hey, we need to fight climate change, is for them to say, I can't pay next month's rent. I'm not going to worry about a decade from now. It's probably not that serious anyway. The penguins can wait in line. If you had an environment where people actually felt their future was secure and that their kids' future is also secure and they're going to be here for a while, and then you say we need to fight climate change, they'll look around and be like, yeah, we do. Because right now they have the boot on their throats, and there's this mindset of scarcity that is making it harder for them to actually address big picture problems. If you lift that mindset of scarcity, not 100%, because that's impossible, it's not human nature, but if you lift it incrementally, you can actually get consensus around climate change much more quickly. But a lot of it is pricing in pollution and changing your measurements so that it actually accounts for the true cost of climate change.
Yeah. So, most of the job you're looking to get is in foreign policy, and we have been at war.
Most of the job I'm looking to get is in foreign policy. I've never heard it described that way, Jake. It's really quite funny.
80%-ish is kind of a global stage thing. So we do want to touch on Iraq and Afghanistan.
Disagree with that description, but
well, ask Barack Obama potentially, but and maybe you can even fold some of your climate change argument into this with how influences on the global stage. But just starting with our longest war right now. Do you support negotiating with the Taliban? And before those broke down, would you also support having the Afghan government basically sit out those negotiations? And then the obvious, second part of that question is, do you bring the troops home, and how quickly?
We've been in a constant state of armed conflict for at least 18 years, and that is not the will of the American people or how it's written up in the Constitution. The problem is that the Congress essentially ceded their input on this with the authorization and use of military force in 2001, said, hey, it's up to the executive branch, and then they washed their hands of it. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. I signed a pledge to end the forever wars and try and put the power to declare war back in the hands of Congress, which would be back in the hands of the American people. I would be willing to sit down with anyone that helps get American troops home, and that includes people that we've been in conflict with for extended periods of time. To me, it's not the will of the American people that troops are in Afghanistan or other foreign theaters for literally decades at this point.
Yeah. And do you think the Afghan government should be folded into those negotiations with the Taliban?
I mean, you'd certainly hope so.
Why do you think they haven't been so far?
No, I think sometimes if you're very, very close to a situation, it's almost harder to get people to the table than if you were a little bit further away from it. Ideally, people who have the highest stake in it would be right there at the table. But I wouldn't preclude any alternative or any option that helps get troops home.
And then just could you lay out broadly how you would see, the American use of force utilized abroad?
Yeah. So I have a 3-part test for the use of military force. Number 1, there has to be a clear, vital national interest or the ability to avert a humanitarian catastrophe. Number 2 are timeline has to be clear enough where you can look troops in the eyes and say, this is when you're coming home, and actually believe it and be able to stick to it and accomplish the mission in that time frame. And number 3, there have to be allies and partners that are willing to undertake the mission with you. If these 3 things are in place, then I would consider sending troops into harm's way. If one of these things is not in place, then I would be highly unlikely to.
Okay.
Well, with all due respect, I think probably everybody thought that was the case when we went into Afghanistan. And here we are 18 years later. So how do you make that determination that you got the partners and that you're going to be able to say, okay, mission accomplished, we're leaving?
So Afghanistan, I agree with you. If you looked at it from day one, it seemed like it would satisfy this test. The question is, what made you think that you were going to be able to get out in a given time frame, and then what did you get wrong? Now, one of the things that I believe I'm clear-eyed about is America's capacity or incapacity to rebuild another country or society. We're not good at rebuilding other places. We're not even good at rebuilding ourselves at this point. You can look at what's happened in Puerto Rico. It's still in a shambles months and months after it was devastated by the hurricane. So how did you misjudge that so badly? How did you think that you were going to be able to get troops out in, let's call it, 5 years or 6 years, and now here we are 18 years later? Do you talk yourself into things? Because when you get in that boardroom, it's very easy for you to talk yourself into things. You'd be like, hey, we can get this done in a particular time frame and get out. I think we have to draw upon past experiences to be realistic about what we can get done in a given time frame. And I've been in enough operating environments to understand how tough and muddy and gritty it gets on the ground in the last mile. Most businesses, most organizations, most operations, the majority of the value is in that last mile. And it's hard to see the last mile from the boardroom very often. So you want to try and get an assessment from someone who's as close to the ground as possible, and then look at them and say, can we get this done in this time frame? Is this actually realistic?
So, since we're on the topic, let's go big. The United States has a rather large stockpile of nuclear weapons. Other countries.
I was wondering where you're going with this. I was like, let's go big.
It all comes back
Let's
to
go
nukes in New Hampshire. Yeah.
So do other countries. You'd like to not foresee ever having to use them, and maybe some people want to get rid of them, but if you do that, then if the other guy doesn't, you're kind of at a disadvantage. So we have them. Under what circumstances could you foresee making the call to use them?
There's a difference between having enough nuclear weapons and then having, frankly, the level we have, where we have the nuclear triad built up, where we can strike in a number of ways in virtually any scenario. I'm actually one of the only candidates who's come out and said we need some kind of multi-party approval system for the use of nuclear weapons. Because right now I talk to people who are in that decision chain, and I tried to find out, hey, after you get the order to launch nuclear weapons, do you have any fail-safes or checks? And they said, no, we do not. Our priority is actually speed. Like, in other words, it's not to make sure that this order is correct, it's to try and launch them as quickly as possible. And so that struck me as the wrong set of priorities if you're in that situation, because if you make the wrong decision there, it's cataclysmic, apocalyptic, it's going to cost millions of lives. And if you stall a little bit and get it wrong, again, because of our naval capability, like, you're still going to be able to get the nuclear weapon off, even if it took you a little bit of extra time to confirm the decision to launch. So number one, we need a multi-factor approval system. It can't just be one individual who says, hey, like, launch the nuclear weapons, then everyone in the chain just says, like fire, fire, fire. There are very few circumstances I can imagine authorizing the use of nuclear weapons. The only way I can imagine doing it is if I was convinced that it would save American lives, save millions of American lives, where we would launch it and disable an offensive strike that was imminently going to kill many, many Americans. That's the only scenario I can imagine actually using nuclear weapons.
Well, the multi-part thing, like, how many people do you bring into the loop, especially like if only, the president and a couple people on the National Security Council know where submarine X is. If you have a multi-step part, theoretically that means more people knowing where those.
I've just required a second person, which right now is not in the chain.
So would that be like the vice president, or who would that be?
Yeah, it's the vice president, and then failing that, the chief of staff or the secretary of defense.
Okay.
But right now, not having any checks strikes me as an awful system when you're talking about the future of civilization.
On immigration, I was wondering what the impetus was behind your plan for a new tier of long-term permanent citizenship, and why do you think that this plan will succeed or has a good chance for success?
Most Americans recognize the reality of the situation we're in right now that we have. So first, let me say I'm the son of immigrants myself, and so I believe immigrants make our country stronger, more dynamic, more vibrant. My father generated over 65 U.S. patents for GE and IBM after immigrating here as a graduate student, and I think that's a win for the U.S. So we should be trying to compete for talent at the highest levels. We should be stapling a green card to the diploma of any student who studies here if they want to stay here, instead of sending them off to compete against us. Now that's a different type of situation than we're talking about with the over 12 million people who are here and undocumented. Now the people who are here and undocumented, number one, you can pretend you can deport them, which is ridiculous. It would collapse regional economies, destroy families. It's essentially an impossibility. So pretending you can do it is a non-starter. Number two is the status quo, where we just have people in this country with unclear legal status. They get into car accidents, their kids are in schools, and they wind up in emergency rooms. Like, you have massive problems attendant with having all these people undocumented. Number three, which is my recommended approach, which most Americans agree we need to head in this direction, is to have a new legal status for people who are here and undocumented that's eventually leading on a very long-term path to citizenship if they are here and pay taxes and have no criminal record and satisfy various requirements over an extended period of time. Now, the fact is, even if we establish this new legal status, many people who are here and undocumented will not sign up for it or register for it. I mean, that's the reality. Like, they're not going to trust virtually anything that documents them in a serious way. But this is the direction we need to go. It's the only reasonable course of action, and the Republicans have historically been on board with this. Marco Rubio championed something similar before he decided it was a political loser for him. And it wasn't just him. Republicans have historically supported something similar.
So, I kind of wanted to fold two questions into one here. And, a lot of what your campaign has looked at is kind of the value of job retraining. Kind of, a lot of times on the stump, I've heard you question the value of a college education. And then, you also have kind of...
I do like college, but...
Yeah. Well, you have a line like it's gotten...
I went to one.
Yeah, it's gotten 3 times more expensive, but has it gotten 3 times better?
This is true.
And trying to rethink, workforce-wise, how do we kind of keep things better developed?
Yes.
Another big, cleavage in our politics right now is you look at whether a voter has a college degree or not, and if they're white without a college degree, the odds that they're... Republican leaning or a Trump voter are pretty high.
Yep.
You've also talked about, I just want to pull this up, when you were on the Joe Rogan show, you had a line that, you guys had an interesting discussion on this, where you said you were with a trucker in Iowa, and you were kind of talking about identity politics, how the Democratic Party, in the eyes of some, has lost touch with working voters. And you said, there's a point at which the Democratic Party used to be very heavily aligned with working class Americans, and now there's some kind of pathology that if the person who's suffering is a white man of a certain background, then the suffering is somehow diminished or accounted less if they're a trucker. You kind of were falling on that line that, maybe some of what people kind of generally brand as political correctness, identity politics has gone too far. I guess what it comes down to is, how much do you think the government should be incentivizing things like a college education and folding in, workforce training, when we also are trying to address issues of, systemic racism, things like that, whether it's Cory Booker having the baby bonds plan or all these other things that are trying to get at that mobility, but a lot of voters think, that's not giving me a fair shot. I'm wondering, when you look at how much you would want to spend on workforce retraining versus, say, debt forgiveness, things like that, how do you think that would affect voters thinking they're getting a fair shake?
Yeah, I love this line of questioning. I also think Jake has an excellent radio voice. I don't know if you use him for podcasts. Do you?
You were the first guest on our podcast.
Look at that. Nice, really?
Yeah.
I have a record of launching podcasts.
Into the stratosphere.
Yeah. I love this line of questioning so much because I think that a lot of the Democratic talking points hinge on this implicit point of view that college is for everyone, that if you're college educated somehow that fixes everything. And we have to face facts that only 33% of Americans are going to graduate from a 4-year university, and that number is remarkably stable. Like, that number is not going to go to 70% anytime soon. And that if you include 2-year programs, you're looking at 42% of the U.S. population. So saying to everyone, what's going to solve everything? Free college. It's like, do I think college should be more reasonably priced? Of course. Why has it gotten 2.5 times more expensive in the last number of years? But if you make it free, does it help the 67% of Americans who are not going to attend? No. Does it change the fact that 40 to 44% of recent college graduates are underemployed doing a job that does not require a degree? No. It makes their underemployment more manageable because they're not also loaded with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. So that's an improvement. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of trying to prepare people for the workforce. The fact is, it's going to be easier. It's easier now to automate away the job that's done by an entry-level college graduate in a field like insurance or accounting. It's going to be easier to automate away that job than it is going to be to automate away an HVAC repair person or a plumber or someone doing line repair. Like, those jobs are actually very hard to automate. And right now, only 6% of our high school students are in technical or apprenticeship programs. In Germany, that's 59%. Think about that gulf. And so what we're doing, we're saying to our kids, hey, go to college, throwing them in a room with textbooks and a teacher. And a lot of these kids are like, I'm not going to go to college. And they're right. They're not going to go to college. So selling college as the only path to a decent life in America, which is, to me, the subtext of a lot of the Democratic talking points, is not the right way to go, and it doesn't address the real problems that are being experienced by the majority of Americans. In my mind, the Democratic Party was the party of the working class person, and right now, for whatever reason, we're going down this other track where we're talking about the concerns of, frankly, more urban residents and areas, and exacerbating this divide between urban and rural, and college-educated and non-college educated in very destructive ways.
You mentioned STEM training and stuff. How does the liberal arts factor into that? Is that more insulated from automation, or is that not something worth the federal government investing in compared to STEM?
And so this is another one of the traps we're getting into, where we're essentially saying that the value of every education is what the market says it's going to be on the outside. Some facts. Only 8% of jobs in America are STEM jobs. So if you're going around saying we're going to make everyone into a coder or engineer, it's not realistic. Number two, a lot of those jobs are the most likely to get automated away. We don't like to talk about this, but artificial intelligence is going to do basic coding in the next number of years. So if we try and turn all the coal miners into coders, we're going to automate away that job too. The goalposts are moving. Instead, we need to humanize the economy and say that human value and economic value are not the same things. If the market says you're suddenly not worth anything because your truck now drives itself, we have to be able to say, look, like, we're bigger than that. You're of course worth something because you're an American, you're a human being, and our economy will work for you too. Instead of trying to talk ourselves into the fact that we're all infinitely adaptable widgets and that we're all going to turn ourselves into efficient economic actors even as the water level rises above us. That's a catastrophic loser over time. It is already tearing us apart. The only way out is to actually evolve in the way we think about ourselves and our value and our work. And that's going to happen right here in New Hampshire. We do not have a choice. You see it more clearly than most everyone else in the country what is happening. It's blasted away. First, it blasted away the factories in the northern part of the state. That was a little while ago. Now it's getting rid of your stores and malls. Soon it's going to creep into your schools and call centers and the rest of it. And then eventually it's going to be on your highways in the form of self-driving cars and trucks. And it's going to be up to you to advance a different vision of this economy and rewrite the rules of the 21st century to work for us, the owners and shareholders of this great nation. If you don't make this case, then we just get another 4 years of the AI getting smarter and the stores closing and people turning on each other because we're trapped in this mindset of scarcity and this struggle for resources, when really, if we get our heads up, there is plenty to go around.
So I sense that we're gonna.
Did you sense that was a closing statement? Did you sense that?
I do want to have one last thing. So, being president, you're the head of 1/3 of the 3 branches of government.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got to deal with Congress. So you've got some really big, different ideas you're putting out there. You get into this position. What happens when you propose some of these and you don't get the 60 votes you need or the 50 votes, depending on what it is?
Of course.
Support from Congress to put them through. What's your plan B?
First, there was a poll in New Hampshire that said that I was one of only 2 candidates in the field that 10% or more of Donald Trump voters say they would actually vote for over Trump in the general election, which makes me one of the strongest bets to beat Donald Trump. It also makes me one of the strongest bets to actually be able to work with Republicans after I'm president. My flagship proposal, the Freedom Dividend, is not a left or right idea. The one state that's had a dividend for almost 40 years is Alaska, which is a deep red state, and it was passed by a Republican governor. Republicans do not hate the idea of money in people's hands. What they hate is the idea of a giant bureaucracy making everyone's decisions for them. So after I'm president, not only will the Democrats and progressives be thrilled to have beaten Donald Trump, but the Republicans will look up and say, wait a minute, I can actually work with this guy. And the Freedom Dividend is going to benefit who? Rural areas, red states on the interior, places that have gotten blasted away by automation. After we pass the dividend, then Americans are going to look up and say, wow, we actually did something I like for a change. And then we can make progress on other things that there's consensus around, like infrastructure, as one example.
Well, let's just assume like Mitch McConnell's like not down at all. He's not buying it. I mean, what do you do if he's going to hold his members away and he can't get that stuff?
Well, Jake, this is the fun part. I want you all to imagine 2021. Andrew Yang's president. We all know it's because of the dividend. And so Mitch says, hey, the cash is going to hurt you. It's a very hard argument to make in Kentucky or anywhere. Imagine me showing up to Kentucky and saying, this man is standing between you and the dividend. What will his offices look like? What will his phone lines look like? Cash is harder to demonize than just about anything under the sun. And Americans instinctively realize that our economy is turned against us and that this is a way to right the ship. I don't need 80% of Congress on board. I just need 51%. This is just a bill, a law like any other. But people sense that I'm very pragmatic and non-ideological and that we can get things done.
I gotta take him for you. Said good.